Hey everybody, welcome to US History. So I'm filming these videos in case my wife goes into labor and I'll be at the hospital, and so you guys can just watch this on Google Classroom. So this lecture is for Tuesday, January 12th. I'm going to pick up with the Trail of Tears, and we're going to try to move all the way through page 200. You've already turned in your reading assessment for pages 195 through 200. So I'm just going to go straight into the lesson here. This is a reminder, though, that current events will be due on Thursday for Moses let's see here. It's the wrong class. So Owen, Sarah, CJ, and Austin. Okay, you'll be going on Thursday. So let's go ahead and pick up with the Trail of Tears. We said by 1838, all Indian tribes except the Cherokee had moved west, and so the American government called on U.S. troops to forcibly move the Cherokees west of the Mississippi River. Many of the Indian families were forced out of their homes at gunpoint. Some Indians were held in detention camps until the march west began. This was a mass forced movement of the Native Americans, moving them off of their land that was rightfully theirs to territory west of the Mississippi River, specifically Oklahoma. Now, why we call this the Trail of Tears is because while these thousands of Indians were moving from their homes to the new Oklahoma territory, they moved in the worst possible time of the year. A lot of it happened in terrible weather. It says on page 194, it says these forced marches west began in the summer, and sickness and drought killed many of the travelers. Several groups waited until fall, but heavy rains became a problem. Travel was difficult and food was scarce, and as winter set in, frigid weather and bad water caused more disease. And so because of all these things, about 4,000 Cherokee Indians died after being forced to march to Oklahoma. Hi. Can I get a hug? Hi, sweetie. What? Oh, can you say hi to the camera? Hi. Oh. Someone just woke up from a nap. Can you give me sugar? Thank you, sweetheart. What, the light is on?
A big bunny.
Oh, there was a big bunny? Where?
In the room.
In the room? Oh my goodness. Alrighty. I love you. Oh, sweet girl. I love you. Okay, one more sugars. Mwah. I love you. Go get your diaper changed. Yeah, I'll see you after the lesson. All right. So, the Trail of Tears, about 4,000 Native Americans died on their trip to the West, and this is why we call this atrocity one of the largest stains on American history. Is known as the Trail of Tears because of those 4,000 deaths. Now, this also translated to the Black Hawk War. Black Hawk was an Indian leader of the Sauk and Fox tribes in northern Illinois, and he had led a resistance against American settlers in the West, burning and raiding settlements there. Now, he also fought against the U.S. troops. And so at this point, because he did not have the power to defend his tribe and to keep fighting against the U.S. troops, he moved into the Iowa Territory. Now, so he moved west from Illinois into Iowa, but his people faced starvation because it was a new territory. They didn't know where to hunt. It was difficult to find food. And so at one point, his people were facing starvation, and so they traveled across the border back into Illinois, where their old hunting grounds were located. And at this point, the American settlers, they saw Black Hawk and his tribe coming across the border, and it scared them because they thought he's here to wage war again. So they called on U.S. troops. U.S. troops came, and Black Hawk and his tribe, they fled. And so the U.S. troops, they gave chase, and they ended up cornering them in a certain location where they had to fight this battle we now call it the Bad Axe Massacre. And so they killed in almost all of Black Hawk's followers. So this battle, where Black Hawk and most of his followers were killed, became known as the Bad Axe Massacre. So our relations with the Indians are pretty strained, I would say, at this point. Not only with the Trail of Tears, but with the Black Hawk War. And that brings us into internal controversies. Now, moving to domestic affairs. Tariffs had been used since Washington's presidency, and we've talked about what tariffs are. Tariffs are taxes on imported goods. Now, there were two types of tariffs. There were revenue tariffs, which were designed to just raise money, and then there were protective tariffs. The difference being, protective tariffs it was a much more aggressive tax on imported goods. It was much higher. And the purpose of this was to discourage foreign business in America by causing people to have to pay a higher amount of money for foreign goods, and it would drive them to American-made goods. And so we call it a protective tariff because it was such a high tariff, it discouraged foreign business, and it protected American industries. Okay, so that's the difference between a revenue and a protective tariff. Now, we've already talked about the region of the United States that disliked tariffs, and that would be the South. The reason why the South disliked tariffs is because it decreased their trade and cotton prices fell. But another reason is the Southerners, they were having to pay higher prices due to these tariffs for goods that they wanted in order to protect businesses that were in the North. Again, we see division here. We don't see much unity with the different regions in the United States. Southerners hate the tariff because they don't want to have to pay more money to protect Northern industries. Now, this is whenever we see the idea of nullification come up again. And we've said that nullification was the idea that a state had a right to nullify a federal law. They don't like a federal law, they say we're canceling it, null and void. We don't have to follow it. We've already talked about in lecture that is a dangerous idea. It is not protected by the Constitution. States do not have rights to say, we don't like this law, we're not going to follow it. Now, John C. Calhoun, he was the vice president to Andrew Jackson. He became the leading defender of states' rights, which means, by default, he was a big supporter of nullification. Now, his home state, South Carolina, threatened to nullify a tariff that was put into place by Jackson's administration. Now, President Jackson, he disagreed with Calhoun on the idea of nullification. And of course, he disagreed with it because he was the president. If you're the president of the United States, you sign a bill into law. It is your job to enforce the law as president of the United States. And so when a state says we're not going to follow it because we don't like it, that is direct insubordination. And so Jackson, because of his position, he does not like nullification. So under pressure, Calhoun resigned the vice presidency. He quit, and he was elected to the South Carolina Senate. So now he quit the vice presidency, and he is serving in the Senate for South Carolina. Not in the U.S. Senate, but the South Carolina Senate, the state Senate. In 1832, Congress passed a new tariff. And when Jackson signed the tariff, the South Carolina legislatures voted to nullify the law, saying that we will secede if you force us to obey this law. They said, we're not going to send out boats to collect tax money from foreign businesses. They said, we don't like this law. We are not going to follow it. And they said they would secede. You need to know for quiz or a test that secede means to withdraw from, to formally withdraw. So they would withdraw from the United States of America and become their own country. That's what they're threatening to do. Now, Jackson, and I mentioned this earlier, he's a brash fellow, right? So he said, fine, I'm going to send a warship and I'm going to send revenue boats, which are boats that would sit out in the harbor. Foreign businesses that were selling their goods, merchant ships, would have to stop, pay the tax, then sail into the port, then they could sell their goods. So he said, I'm going to send a warship and a revenue boat to Charleston. And he stated that if they defied the Constitution and went ahead with ignoring federal law, that he would show up personally on the battlefield and hang John C. Calhoun. Now, I think in your textbook, it's pretty edgy, okay, what Jackson was threatening to do. He told John C. Calhoun, he said, I'll hang you from the highest tree in South Carolina. So he's using a more direct tactic, not one of diplomacy. Basically saying, fine, if you don't obey the law, then you're going to pay the price with your life. So Congress in South Carolina, they compromised. John C. Calhoun didn't want to be hanged, and South Carolina did not want to go to war with the United States Navy. And so they signed the Compromise of 1833. And the compromise basically stated, we are going to implement this new tariff at its original rate, the tax rate. But over time, we will lower the tariffs. Okay, so the United States government gets what they want in that they get the original tax amount. But South Carolina gets what they want because that tax amount is decreased. You need to know that that is the Compromise of 1833. So please understand, you'll need to know the idea of nullification, okay, and that's what Calhoun and Jackson disagreed upon. You need to know that it was South Carolina that threatened to secede if they had to follow that law. And you need to know about Jackson's response, and then, of course, the Compromise of 1833. And that brings us to the National Bank, a whole nother issue in and of itself. So Nicholas Biddle was the president of the Bank of the United States. And if you remember, Alexander Hamilton created the National Bank, which at that time also went by the name the Bank of the United States. Now, the National Bank had a charter or a contract with the United States government that would have to be renewed every so many years. And so let's say that the years of this contract were running out, they would need to renew it so that the government would have a deal with this bank to put all of their funds into the Bank of the United States. So Biddle wanted the bank to be rechartered. He wanted to renegotiate a contract. And so he tried to begin to find favor with Jackson. Basically schmooze, okay, with Jackson, try to get into his good graces so that he could recharter the bank. Now, the bad thing for Biddle is that Jackson hated the National Bank. In fact, he turned the state banks against the National Bank, saying, you don't need the National Bank, they're just using you. He tried to really destroy the National Bank, and he vetoed a bill that was put into place by Congress that would recharter the bank. So he doesn't want to renew their relationship with the bank. He wants it to dissolve. And so since Jackson wanted the National Bank to dissolve completely, he ordered the Secretary of the Treasury to deposit government money into state banks. Now, the crazy thing about this is that the Secretary of the Treasury said, I don't have the authority to do so, and if I do, it's going to cause an economic panic. So Jackson fired him. The next Secretary of the Treasury, he was told, I need you to put this money into these state banks. He said it's going to cause an economic panic. I'm not doing it. Jackson fired him. Until finally, the Secretary of the Treasury, the third one that Jackson hired, he decided to deposit government money into separate state banks. Because here's the thing, a bank cannot survive without money. And so if Jackson takes away all of the government finances from the National Bank, it'll dissolve. So these state banks, they became known as Jackson's pet banks. And so when Biddle tried to punish Jackson by calling in loans from the pet banks, it sent the economy into a panic. Surprise, surprise. Now this caused inflation. And so this is an increase in the money supply that causes a corresponding rise in prices that alarmed Jackson. And so he tried to pass the Specie Circular, and this called for anyone buying government land to pay in gold or silver. But not everyone has gold and silver. And so many people weren't able to pay off their debts with paper money. They lost their farms, their land, and more banks failed. So Jackson therefore caused an economic panic. We're going to stop there, and I'll see you next time.